Okay, let us start. Hello everybody, my name is Frédéric Stilmant. I am a pastor in the eastern part of France and the Evangelical Lutheran Church Synod of France. And this presentation will be about Noah, the flood, and our salvation from God's judgment through baptism. Can you all hear me well, or should I speak louder?
We can hear you.
Yeah? Okay, if my voice gets lower with time, just raise your hand and I'll make some more effort. Okay, so we are going to deal with a story of the Old Testament. The Old Testament is full of stories, and often there is this question, okay, what do we do with these stories? And especially the accounts of the flood in Genesis 6 to 9. What, is this only a story for children? I have a daughter, she has children's books, and in the Christian's Bible, the Christian books, the story of Noah is in every Christian book. It has nice colors with a rainbow. It has plenty of animals that you can teach the name of to your child. The flood is also something we hear about at Sunday school, but not so much on Sunday during the church services. There are not many sermons on this topic, and it is also a long story, so it is not super easy to address it in a sermon. But yeah, for several reasons, this seems to be a story that is rather for children. Is it the case? And when we read it, is Noah only an example of faith? That he believed God's word, did what God told him to do, and was saved because he trusted God's promise. This story of the flood might also make you quite uneasy if you think about all these people who died, all these animals, innocent animals, you could say, died. You could say, okay, this is just horrible. Is it the case? And then, is this just a story in the sense that it has no connection with actual events? And just to say from the beginning, my position on this is that I take what the Bible says literally, and I trust it. Among other reasons, because of what we will learn today, and the fact that this Old Testament story tells us about something that happened much, much later, when Jesus came. This is something that you have nowhere else in the story of humanity, that someone tells you about things and later on you realize, oh, this actually happened. So what we are going to do is we're going to read large portions of the narrative. It's quite long. We won't be able to read everything, but still we'll take time to read the text. And then we will dare to ask good questions. And we will find that this text is not content with itself, but it is pointing to something bigger. We'll see that here in the Old Testament we have an image of the New Testament, and here I use the word image because it is in the theme of this year's conference. There are other technical words that would be more appropriate, but let's work with this one for now. So why are we going to do this? At several places in the New Testament, Jesus said that the Old Testament, we call that the Scriptures, are actually about Him. And the Apostle Peter wrote in his first epistle that the flood prefigured our baptism. So it was an image of our baptism. Okay, I mean, they can say that, but can we check it? Can we make sure that this is right? When Paul preached to the Jews in Berea, Luke writes, they received the word with all eagerness, examining the Scriptures daily to see if these things were so. So there is no problem with asking the question, is this really as you say? Peter, for example, or Jesus, when you say that the Old Testament is about you. I mean, many people read the Old Testament and say, I don't see Jesus anywhere. So we will do the same as the Jews in Berea. And by doing so, we will be strengthened in our faith, and we will also get a better picture of what we already know. Stories are good for learning. Some of you find perhaps that theology can be very abstract, and it can be. But if the Old Testament is full of stories, it is to teach you these things about the Christian faith in a way that is very natural. We all learn through stories. Things that happen to us, that we learn by experience, and things that happen to others, and that we learn through their stories. I said that we will dare to ask questions. What is a good question? A question that is suggested by the text. There are moments in the text when you feel like, okay, here I should stop reading and think about. Not simply read through and say, okay, yeah, nice story. No, stop here. Here is something that needs to be addressed, and think about it. A good question is a question that comes from taking God's word seriously. It must be true, but how can it be true? And such questions will lead us to find Christ in the Old Testament. So let's start. We could start earlier, but we will start with Genesis 6, verse 5 to 8. I have written the references so that all of you can follow along in your own Bible, in your own language, if you're not very much familiar with English. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And the Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. So the Lord said, I will blot out men whom I have created from the face of the land, men and animals and creeping things and birds of the heavens, for I am sorry that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. So the starting point is the sin of man. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. In this verse, we have a lot about what sin is. We have sin as an action. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth. These are things that you can see, observe, that people do. But God also sees further than that. He sees in the heart where sin is also present. And what God sees is something that is quite extreme. Every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. This is so extreme that most people don't believe this. Even many Christian denominations don't take this seriously. The Lutheran confessions say about sin, about original sin, that it is so great that we cannot see it, but we need to believe what the Bible says about it to us. And okay, this is not exactly in the text, but if you understand that man's heart doesn't fear, love, and trust God, if you realize that sin is not only an action, but it has something to do with a relationship to God, then you can better understand why God sees this in a human heart. So it doesn't mean that every action that human beings do are bad. If it would be so, humanity would stop in a second. If parents wouldn't feed their children anymore, which is a good action. But behind these actions, God sees man's heart full of evil lust and inclination. And this is not the heart as God has made it. This verse is also important because it shows that God's condemnation is right. We can sometimes doubt that God's judgment is right. Sometimes we might fear that perhaps he is a bit hard on some people who actually are innocent. This verse at the start of the story shows you that what will happen is God's right judgment. So God's reaction to the sin of man is that he regretted that he made him. He is grieved. He says, I am sorry that I've made them. And this is something extreme. If you think about it, that this is what God thinks about humanity after the fall. For God, it is painful to see the disaster that the sin of man brought about in his creation. So his reaction is that he will blot out man from the earth. Let's take a closer look to this verb. I will blot out men from the face of the land. You could also translate, I will wash away men from the face of the land, or I will wipe him away. This same verb is used in another biblical text in 2 Kings chapter 21. I will wipe Jerusalem as one wipes a dish. So this is the image that you need to keep in mind about the flood, that there is a stain in the creation, and just as you would wash the floor when it is dirty, God is about to wash away man from the face of the land, because it is man himself, humanity, that is the stain, the problem. And this way of describing also makes a connection between the flood and something you can relate to from everyday life. For you, it is normal that if there is something dirty somewhere, you will wash it. So God's judgment on humanity is also something normal. That is not, if he judges, it is not because he is impatient or he is bad, as some people would feel. No, it is just something even that we, even as sinful beings, can relate to. And the waters of the flood are here to clean the earth. But at the beginning of this story is also God's grace. So we read, the Lord saw the wickedness of man, that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, but Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. You could also translate, the Lord was gracious with Noah. And here lies an emphasis of the story. It is actually the first time in the Bible that this word, favor or grace, is used. This doesn't mean that people who lived before Noah or alongside with him did not find favor in God's eyes, but it is a way to put emphasis on this story. Okay, when you come to this story, you are going to learn about God's grace. And the first time it is mentioned, it is in this context of God bringing about judgment on the earth. So beside his judgment, there is also his grace, which is undeserved. We continue our reading. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God. And Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. You might wonder, okay, what made Noah righteous? Was perhaps his heart different than the others? Was he an exception? Or what? I mean, what made Noah righteous? The correct answer is that his faith in the coming seed, in the promised Messiah, made him righteous. This is not in this text, but because it is not an emphasis of this story. It will be very much an emphasis of Abraham's story. So one story follows the other, and every story brings teaching about some new topics. So here it is simply said that Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. The emphasis is that Noah alone is presented as righteous and blameless. And yet, he will not be the only one who will be protected from the flood. So here in this story, it is not so much about the question, what made Noah righteous? But it is showing that the righteousness of Noah brought life also to others. in the midst of God's judgment. We continue our reading. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. And God saw the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. And God said to Noah, I have determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence through them. Behold, I will destroy them with the earth. I'd like to highlight a few verbs here that in the ESV are translated with different English words, which is correct to follow English usage. But actually, in the Hebrew original, all these verbs are of the same root. So I will replace them with this verb to ruin. Now the earth was ruined in God's sight. All flesh had ruined their way on the earth, and then God says, behold, I will ruin them with the earth. The earth was ruined. Imagine this is your house. It once was a beautiful house, but it got ruined by a disastrous event, and this is what you see when you look at it. There is nothing good that you can make out of it anymore. When you see this, the only thing that you can do is to hire someone with heavy equipment that will just tear everything down, that will somehow bring this destruction to completion, and then you would build a new house. So this is something very important about sin. Often we think that sin is a problem that you can address by fixing a few things. Many philosophers have said, okay, if you educate the young generation in a better way, without violence, for example, or if you have good morals and so on, then the world will become a better place, and then all these wars and so on, they will end. What God sees is that the earth was ruined, and the solution to this problem had to go through destruction. So destruction is part of the salvation that God brings. There is no salvation from sin without destruction of what has been corrupted by it. And a more literal translation of a sentence that we've read before is, God says, the end of all flesh has come before me. This is also like the first time in the Bible that God speaks about the end. So the narrative of the flood is about the end of all flesh. But the flood is also the salvation of Noah and his family. There's the other side. Let's continue. Verse 14, God says to Noah, make yourself an ark. So here we can see salvation in what God says. Then God describes the ark. I will pass these aspects. For behold, I will bring a flood of waters upon the earth to destroy all flesh in which is the breath of life under heaven. Everything that is on the earth shall die. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall come into the ark, you, your sons, your wife, and your son's wife with you. And of every living thing of all flesh, you shall bring 2 of every sort into the ark to keep them alive with you. So here we have God making a promise. And this is everywhere in the Old Testament that God makes promises. And this promise is connected with the ark. In the ark, God will preserve Noah, his family, and the animals. He will keep them alive through the flood. I will establish my covenant with you, says God. The details of this covenant will be given later, but already here God has committed himself to do something for their salvation. And again, this word covenant appears in the Bible for the first time at this place. So we will get through this story a first sense of what a covenant is when God uses this word. Let's continue. Noah did this. He did all that God commanded him. Then the Lord said to Noah, "Go into the ark, you and all your household, for I have seen that you are righteous before me in this generation." Here you have, you can see Noah's faith. In Noah's time, a worldwide flood is something unseen and unbelievable. As unbelievable as it is for most people nowadays. But Noah believed God's words. He believed his word of judgment, that the flood would come, and he also believed his word of promise, that in the ark he would be kept safe. And that is the reason why he built this ark. So building this ark was an act of faith. And then in the first chapter 7 first verse, I have seen that you are righteous before me in this generation. This comes just after what Noah did out of faith. So here you have a connection between Noah's righteousness and his faith, his righteousness coming from his faith. But as I said, it will be even more obvious in the case of Abraham. Still, we have this comment in the New Testament, Hebrews 11, chapter 7. By faith, Noah, being warned by God concerning events as yet unseen, in reverent fear, constructed an ark for the saving of his household. By this, he condemned the world and became an heir of the righteousness that comes by faith. We skip some parts of the narrative, but here the description of the flood. All flesh died that moved on the earth, birds, livestock, beasts, all swarming creatures that swarm on the earth, and all mankind. He blotted out every living thing that was on the face of the ground, men and animals and creeping things and birds of the heavens. Only Noah was left, and those who were with him in the ark. And the waters prevailed on the earth 150 days. Imagine Noah in the midst of God's judgment for such a long time, water everywhere. This must have been very challenging for his faith to go through that. But God remembered Noah and all the beasts and all the livestock that were with him in the ark. And God made a wind blow over the earth, and the waters subsided. God remembered Noah. If God was a man, you might think, okay, this means that God had forgotten or was not paying attention to Noah, but now finally he is. No, this is not the case. God doesn't change. So what does this mean, that God remembered Noah? To remember means to think about something in the past. So is there anything important from the past that is relevant here in the midst of God's judgment? Yes, there is. There is the promise that God has made to Noah. And this promise requires an action from God if he is to be faithful to his word. So this is why it is said that God remembered Noah. He remembered the covenant that he would make with him. He remembered his promise. So this promise that was at the beginning of the story continues to be a very central element in the story. Then God said to Noah, "Go out from the ark, you and your wife and your sons' wives with you. Bring out with you every living thing that is with you of all flesh, birds and animals and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, that they may swarm on the earth and be fruitful and multiply on the earth." When you hear this, normally you should have an echo in your ear of the story of the creation of man. Actually, already here, and God made a wind blow over the earth and the waters subsided. In Hebrew, wind and spirit are the same word. So just as in the beginning the Spirit of God was hovering above the water, and then God brought dry land out of water and then filled it with animals of all kinds that had to multiply and to fill the earth. So he is acting now again. So after the flood comes a new creation. In the ark, Noah and his family were brought safely through the flood into a new creation. That is a way to summarize the events. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord and took some of every clean animal and some of every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And when the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma, the Lord said in his heart, "I will never again curse the ground because of man. For the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth. Neither will I ever again strike down every living creature as I have done. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease." Have you noticed this verse? The intention of man's heart is evil from his youth. Does this remind you of something? This was the very beginning of the story of the flood. This was the reason for the flood. And here, after the flood, in this kind of new creation, still you have this, that God sees that the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth. And here you have also Noah included. If before you could say, okay, perhaps Noah was different. No, here you have only 8 people among whom Noah, and this is what God says about their heart. So, a good question to ask here. Did the flood actually solve the problem from the beginning? The problem was that sin had ruined God's creation. And God's reaction was He destroyed it. The waters of the flood brought death to every living creature. And then he recreated the world and repopulated it with the people and animals that he brought safely through the flood. Noah, the righteous, was the new head of this new world, just like Adam was the head of the first world, you could say. But here, at the close of the story, sin is still in man's heart. So what kind of story is this? I mean, you cannot just read that verse and say, oh yeah, okay, and continue reading and saying, okay, this makes sense, or this must make sense in a way. No, here's a question to ask. Did the flood solve the problem? And often the assumption that we make, I've heard this even from teachers, is that the flood was somehow a failed attempt of God. He wanted to solve the problem of sin, and then he took the best of all humanity, and he restarted everything with these best people of all. But no, it did not work. By the way, this is a good story that shows that if you think that the problem in the world is because of others, the story of Noah tells you, okay, you can make this experiment having the perfect world, and then God would put you as the most perfect human being in this perfect world, and suddenly it would not be perfect anymore because you are there and sin is in you. But some people also think, okay, perhaps God changed his mind. Perhaps, I don't know, he saw all the destruction, all these animals that died and were innocent and so on, and said, okay, I was a bit too harsh perhaps with this flood. No. All these thoughts are not taking God's word seriously. They are not taking God seriously. Because, remember, already before the flood, God made a promise. I will establish my covenant with you. Back then, God didn't give much detail about this covenant. But now, after the flood, he is sharing the content of this covenant. And here it comes. Then God said to Noah and to his sons with him, behold, I establish my covenant with you and your offspring after you, and with every living creature that is with you. I establish my covenant with you, and here it comes, that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. So from the beginning, God had decided that after the flood, there would be no more flood. What he said after the flood, he had decided already before the flood. So he already knew in advance that in themselves, the hearts of Noah and his family were not different from the others. God knew in advance that the flood would not be the final solution to the problem of sin. So what? If the flood was not Noah's final salvation, there are still some signals in the text, in this covenant that God makes with Noah, that suggest that another event will follow. He says, while the earth remains. So this suggests that the earth will have an end. If you remember, the end of all flesh has come before my eyes. It is still before God's eyes. He also says, neither will I ever again strike down every living creature as I have done. As I have done. So with the flood. There might be another way he will use to bring an end to the earth. So this is how we come to this conclusion that another event, a greater event, must come, in which everything that God has said about salvation will become reality. This is the same. But then why the flood? Think about it. You now, after Noah, you have, humanity has made this experience of the flood. So since the flood, every washing that God would command or would institute would have this event in its background. So you have that in the Old Testament with several washings that need to be done, and sometimes you wonder, okay, why are these things so important to wash? Your hands and so on as a priest. If you remember that the flood was a washing away of man, who was the real problem in creation, then you can see in all these washings that were commanded by God a reminder that the stain that needs to be washed away is not dirt, it's not something exterior to man, but it is sin that is in our own members. So the problem that God has to solve and His salvation needs to be greater than only these exterior washings. And the flood shows what God is going to do. Not only have you this new creation after the flood that was parallel to the first creation, but you often have that in the Old Testament. For example, that prophets need to do some things in order to show the people what God is going to do. So God uses events to tell people about things that are going to happen. So with the flood, you already have a picture of God's judgment, of God's end judgment. Knowing that the end judgment will be something greater than the flood. And this brings us to the New Testament. Because at the beginning of the Gospels, you have a washing that is performed by John the Baptizer. It's baptism. And you might wonder, okay, baptism is suddenly appearing in the Bible, and it sounds like something new. But actually, if you remember the things we've talked about the flood, then baptism is new, but it is in the continuity of God teaching His people about sin and about salvation. You might wonder, why did Jesus get baptized? He was righteous. Yeah, just like Noah. And then perhaps the story of Noah helps you getting a better feeling, a better sense of what is happening here when you see Jesus being baptized, when you see Jesus getting out of the waters, and this voice from heaven saying that you are my beloved Son in whom I'm well pleased, and the Holy Spirit coming down on Jesus as a dove. We did not read this in the flood because I think it's very it is known to everybody that Noah sent a dove that came back with an olive branch, giving the sign of the new creation. So there are many connections that are there. You might also perhaps wonder why in the New Testament baptism is connected to death. For example, when Jesus talks about his crucifixion, he says that he has to go through a baptism, that his disciples, or he asked his disciples if they can go through this baptism that he is going to go through, or to drink that cup that he is going to drink. And again, you might wonder, okay, why is the washing, so baptism, connected with death? Yeah, if you have read the flood, then you know that when God washes, this is connected with the destruction of everything that is bad, everything that is sinful, and that has infested the whole creation through man. But baptism is not simply physical death, because this is not the solution. This is not the salvation from our sin. It is death into Jesus. And this is the greater event that the flood was prefiguring, or that the flood was an image of. That Jesus would go through death and rise again, and that we, like the family of Noah, we cannot say that we are righteous in ourselves, but we are connected with Jesus in this ark, and even if the water of baptism are the waters of God's judgment, of death that comes upon all flesh, because we hold to the promise that is in baptism, through this faith in this promise, we will go through this judgment of God, protected in this ark, in this promise that God has given us. And it is actually so that with baptism we are already saved. In hope, of course, but we have already gone through God's judgment. We have, by hope, already entered into God's new creation. Again, some people, some Christian denominations who don't have a right understanding of baptism might wonder, why does the New Testament insist on the fact that there is only one baptism? If you understand baptism as your commitment to God, giving your heart to God, you fail again and again, and you have this desire to go through baptism again, to say again to God that, now I'm starting again, and this will be the good time. No. The Bible doesn't teach that baptism is our commitment to God, but that baptism is our salvation. It is our salvation from God's judgment. And we are not saved from God's judgment apart from God's judgment. Just as the waters of the flood came also on Noah and his family, we also go through God's judgment. We go through death. There is no escape from death apart from going through death, as Luther says. But the difference is that we have the promise. Just like Noah had the promise of God connected with the ark, that in the ark God would protect him in the midst of his judgment. Yeah, I think I will end here for my presentation and perhaps take time for questions. Don't hesitate either to ask questions about things that I've said and that were not very clear to you, or to ask questions about things that were not addressed in this presentation. And yeah, let's also I hope that our discussion will also help us go deeper into our understanding of our baptism and our salvation, because that was again the goal of this presentation, to give you a bigger picture of what happened when you got baptized. And yeah, perhaps I forgot to say one thing that I mentioned at the very beginning, but Jesus, when he comes, he doesn't do like other religious leaders. Other religious leaders, they basically come and say, well, forget about what you have heard before. It was wrong, or perhaps it was not as good as what I'm teaching you now. Don't listen to the others, listen to me instead. Jesus is the only one who comes and says, listen to all these prophets, all these people of God that have talked or written things down. Read these stories, and then you will know who I am. You will, actually everything will already be said. When Jesus comes and speaks, he is saying things that were already announced before, and he simply made them clearer and did what was promised. But now time for questions.